Good morning to you, viewers. Here am I once again with you, the state of the nation. We have decided, because of the various kind of requests we've been getting about our program and its informative nature, that we'll bring to you a program the first week in November. That is today, the 4th day of November. And we will still come back to you again on the 4th Sunday in November, where you will have another program, the state of the nation. I'm your host for today's program, Clayton Hinds. And with me in the studio today is Mr. Vincent Alexander and Mr. Aubrey Norton. These two gentlemen will assist us in today's program and will take you through making their views known and their comments in relation to the program we have outlined today. For today's program, we will be looking at celebration. Just recently, the PNCR observed and celebrated its 55th year in existence, and the PPPC celebrated its 20th year in power. Both are celebrations. One, the PPPC in government, and the PNCR, its existence. What I'd like to do today is to go back in time historically, and I want these two gentlemen, we will look at the existence, because you may know that before the PNCR came into existence, it was the PPP, and at one stage it was two PPP, one led by Burnham and one led by Dr. Jagan. So first of all, I want to ask Aubrey, let him take us back in time as to what dictated, what actually were responsible for the establishment of the PPPC.
Well, first of all, the origins of the PPP dates back to the Political Affairs Committee, which on the return of Dr. Jagan and some others started to address the social, economic and political conditions of the people in British Guyana. They carried the struggle, and at one stage the focus was on obtaining internal self-government, which for the first time limited internal self-government was obtained in 1953.
Yes.
But on the 1st of January 1950, the People's Progressive Party was born with Jagan and Burnham at the helm. Now, it is well known that there were serious ideological differences between Burnham and Jagan. Burnham was a rabid pro-Soviet communist. Jagan was a rabid pro-Soviet communist. Burnham, on the other hand, believed that Guyana was in the Western Hemisphere close to the United States, and it had to develop a policy of surviving sensibly. And Burnham was a socialist who believed that one had to take into consideration the realities of the Western Hemisphere. I think that led to a lot of ideological differences between Burnham and Jagan. For instance, Dr. Jagan said very early that one had to pursue this question of communism and socialism. Burnham felt in the first phase one had to obtain independence because, in Burnham's word, a socialist colony is a contradiction. Those differences, the PPP likes to say that it was power and solely power that caused Burnham to have differences with the PPP, but an investigation will show that they had deep, different ideological positions. And even when it came to the question of Caribbean integration, Burnham and Jagan differed.
Would you agree that deep ideological differences were one of the bases upon which the split came about?
Yes, it did. I think as well that they underplayed the fact of Chetty Jagan's limitation as a visionary leader. Burnham clearly had a clearer vision, and as we go down in the program and we deal with what Burnham had adumbrated at the time, you will see that Burnham had a clearer vision as to where he wanted to take Guyana and how he intended to do so that Dr. Jagan. It is in that context the split in 1955 occurred, and I would differ with a lot of mainstream people, because for me, the PNC this year is celebrating 57 years of its existence. It is, however, celebrating 50, and
55.
Even this is questionable. If you say it's celebrating 55 years as PNC, you will run into difficulty. Because in 2001, I think it was, the name was changed to
PNCR.
PNCR. So I think we have to recognize that the institution called the PNC existed for 57 years. After the split at the Metropole Cinema in the PPP in 1955, the Burnhamite PPP emerged. So you had the PPP Jaganite, PPP Burnhamite. And I'm making this point fundamentally because if you look at Muhammad Ali, he was born Cassius Clay.
Yes.
His name changed, I think, in 68 or 69 to Muhammad Ali. Would you say that he was born in 68 or 69? One has to take the origin, and the origin of the PNC is in 1955 with the advent of the PPP Burnhamite. After the 57 election in October, it changed its name to the PNC. So the PNC emerged in terms of nomenclature, name, in 1957. It then changed its name in 2001 and became PNCR. So the institution called the PNC originated in 1955 as a result of the split in the PPP, and Burnham emerged as the leader of the PNC.
Yeah, Vincent, I want to bring you in here because I'm sure you have maybe some views in relation to what influenced this split. Aubrey very clearly spelled out that it was ideological differences, and maybe you have some other views on that.
Well, I agree with Aubrey that the differences were ideological. And as a consequence of the ideological differences, there were different strategic approaches to the national struggle. And it's that difference in strategic approach that really brought the things to an end in terms of split in the party. But one needs to emphasize and reiterate the question of ideological difference, because very often people attempt to argue that it was merely Burnham's ambition that caused the split. Not that somebody should not be ambitious. But if one looks to the conduct of the PNC and the conduct of the PPP, one can see clearly ideological differences. For example, if you take the incidents in, I think it's 1968, in Czechoslovakia with the Soviet invasion, and the way in which Jagan embraced that invasion in Czechoslovakia, and the way in which the PNC would have distanced itself, it showed you clearly that there was difference in thinking between the leadership of the PNC and the leadership of the PPP, that is between Burnham and Jagan. The other point I want to make in relation to what Aubrey said, the PPP tend to lay claim to all of the PPP from 1950. One should recognize that the PPP of 1950 to 1955 is not the same PPP that you have today, because there was a split in the party. And therefore, one could see, in some regards, the PPP of today and the PNC of today as offsprings of the PPP of 1950-1955. And therefore, both parties, in some regard, can lay claim to the PPP prior to 1955. And in that regard, one can see Burnham, first Minister of Education,
yes,
and his articulation in education, having its roots in the PPP, but being manifest even after 1955 in terms of the policies and programs of the PNC.
We should add as well that a lot of the writings that formulated the vision of the PPP were done by Forbes Burnham. It is well known that in the PPP journal, The Thunder, Forbes Burnham was one of the key writers. And when you go back to the Thunder that predated 55, you see a level of intellectual capacity that you didn't see in the post-1955 era. And I wanted to make that point.
All right, I want us to just jump a little ahead, because we had Burnham assisting in forming the PPP, and then we moved to 55, where they had the split in 57. Was it?
No,
when was
the
it?
split was 55.
The split was in 55. Where,
55,
oh yes,
April.
where they had a two PPP that was led by Dr. Jagan, and a PPP that was led by Forbes Burnham. Now we move to the establishment and the formation of the PNC. You want to tell me the origin of the PNC? How would that?
Well, the PNC emerged, like we said, as a result of the split in 1955. Burnham roamed Guyana and put in place the party group system, so that the party developed a group structure. And the membership, one of the characterizing features of the PNC for many years was its strong root at the group level, which produced leadership at the community level that helped to organize and educate and prepare people for political struggle. In fact, I have argued in some of the things I would have written that it is the work of Burnham putting the political structure in place that is responsible for the life of the PPP, of the PNC until now. And in fact, I believe the PNC survival has to be dependent on that kind of work and not an elitist approach to politics. The other thing I would say about the PNC is that apart from its grassroots base, it was able to mobilize serious intellect that give leadership to the party. The PNC historically has been a combination of intellectual capacity and grassroots outreach. The party that we are talking about is a party that in the early stage had the brains of Aubrey Burnham. It had the brains of Rashley Jackson, Shashidat Ramphal. It had the brains of Shahabuddin, Kami Ramsarup, Haslin Paris. If you check what the intellectual capacity of the PNC was, you will see that the party had an excellent gel of ordinary people, grassroots, and an intellectual capacity that inundated, swamped the PPP in terms of vision and giving intellectual and other forms of leadership to the party. And I believe it is that foundation that has made the PNC into the institution it is. That is not to say the PNC is not like any other party. Every political party, the PPP, the PNC, the Alliance for Change, every political party has always been a combination of forces. There will be those in the party who believe that politics is just about playing games and power. There are going to be those in the party that believe that politics is about the organization of people to achieve their objectives and in the people's interest, and whichever force would have won out in the process tends to determine the approach of the party at a particular time.
I want to go, Vincent. Okay, you.
Well, I'd like to follow up on what Aubrey was saying in terms of leadership. On one hand, we talk about Jagan and Burnham as the leaders, but on the other hand, we have to talk about the leadership at large across the parties. And I think that is where one finds a fundamental difference between the PNC and the PPP. To some extent, the PNC was more urban-based. The PPP was more rural-based. And when one looked at the social structure of the society, I think the PNC was able to incorporate into its leadership a larger element of the middle class across the country. The PPP was not able to incorporate that large element of the middle class, even when the split came about in the party at the level of the middle class, across ethnic bounds, across ethnic boundaries. One could see the middle class, Indo-middle class, Afro-middle class, going to the PNC and the more rural-based, peasant-based personnel going towards the PPP. And that's an important factor in the history and evolution of the country, even today, as we look at the government. So that the PNC was endowed with the middle class, which has historically, not in Guyana, across the world, been the class that has given leadership in countries that have been coming out of a colonial state, and even predating colonial countries. When one looks at the French Revolution, one could have seen the relationship between the middle class and the broad mass in its attempt to bring about the French Revolution. So that an advantage, I would say, and a significant difference between the two parties was that the PNC was able to have in its leadership a broader band of the middle class, and therefore had a stronger leadership element, and therefore was not forced to be essential in its undertaking as the PPP was. But the fact of the matter is the PPP being forced to be central was not only a function of its composition, but it was also a function of the ideologies it embraced. The PPP embraced democratic centralism, which is a top-down system. The PNC was more mass-based and bottom-up in that regard.
But there are two other elements to be added. I agree with Vincent on the middle class position. If you observe the PNC points of weakness were really the points when the middle class became dissatisfied with the PNC. And unless it is understood that a political party could never be just ordinary people or people to the top, it has to be a good combination of the middle class and the low class. I want to also make this point about the PPP. Vincent did not touch on the business class, but the business class always feared the PPP, even though a large percentage of the business class was Indo-Guyanese. They feared the PPP, and the PPP distrusted them. What that has caused is when the PPP come to power, they had to find a new upper class, a new business class, and I think that is responsible for their link to drugs. Because it is those who are involved, apart from the traditional, don't let us forget, there are traditional middle class, traditional upper class and business class people who were Indo-Guyanese who went to the PPP. I'm not saying none went. There were those that were there. But the significant change with the PPP in power is that it has contributed to the development of a narco-criminal upper class. And that narco-criminal upper class is influencing the PPP to the point where the PPP has become a corrupt machinery. And I think that has to be factored in if one is to understand the criminality and the disposition of the leadership of the PPP at this stage.
I want to tell our viewers that your chance will come very soon. We're going to be opening the lines for calls on this program. Gentlemen, I want to go to the two government. The PPP had led this country before '64. Burnham came to power in 1964. I want us to look at, first of all, that period before Forbes Burnham came to power in '64, and then we're going to look and see what were some of the policies and the direction in which he was channeling the country, and in what direction the country was going before he came into power. You want to go on that first, Vincent?
Well, one of the points I would like to make in that regard, and a point which is still very, very relevant even today as we speak, is that before '64, the PPP government always sought to put its membership, its followers, into positions of prominence in a manner that was not helpful to the country, because some of the people who it sought to put into prominence were not in fact qualified. And it follows on what I was saying earlier, that they didn't command the middle class, but the PPP has always been focused on power. How does one control power? And the very words of Chedi Jagan tells you clearly what he meant by that. He always talked about not only legislative power and parliamentary power, he talked also about administrative power. In fact, he came back into government in 1992 saying that he did not have administrative power. What did he mean by that? He meant by that PPP did not have its people in place in the administration, meaning in the ministries where services are actually delivered. That's what he called administrative power. And he came back in '92 saying, I do not have administrative power. That is not classical theory. Classical theory talks about separation of the state, and it talks about the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And that is where power is located in the classical theory. But Jagan talks about administrative power, the actual level of delivery of services. And so, whilst in 92 he said he didn't have actual power, it was demonstrated before 1964 how he saw power by the way in which he sought to man the system with party cronies, irrespective of whether they were qualified. And so you talk about people who didn't have even a proper secondary education ending up as headmasters and headmistresses in the system. So one of the problems we had is that, yes, we were a colony. Yes, we wanted to break away from being a colony, but you don't throw away the baby with the bathwater. The British has in some regard built up a cadre, if not a cadre, a system of relative meritocracy in terms of the public service. And here was Jagan breaking down that system, trying to put his hand in power, using his political cronies. And it's important to note that origin because as we come today in Guyana, we've seen a repeat of that by the PPP, where they have attempted in the public sector to implant their cronies as a way of putting their hand on what they perceive to be the real access to power.
Burnham came to power in 64, Aubrey.
But
what were the conditions? And I want you to take up from where Vincent left off and then go to 64.
I'll go to the conditions, but I wanted to suggest that what Vincent said is absolutely correct, and it didn't change in terms of the return to power in 92. The mentality, I always remember Minister Roy when he went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Here was a man who his first task was to search the people in the ministry who weren't qualified to be there. When it turned out that you had a professionally appointed ministry with well-qualified people, you turned to the task of getting rid of them regardless. Now, I'm making this point to establish later that the government does not necessarily see a place for professionalism. The government approach to stock in the public service is, first, if you are pliant and are going to accept and break the rules, we keep you. But we will bring whoever we feel we should bring, regardless of the qualification. No wonder Driver ended up on a main board, state board. There's a particular young man who I taught at the University of Guyana. His father is a permanent secretary. He arrived in the Ministry of Finance before he got a degree into a position that you needed a degree. And there are other cases. I'm making this to point out, to establish Vincent's point that they do not believe in a bureaucracy that is meritocratic, based on merit. Now let's go to the situation of Guyana when the PNC came to power. When the PNC came to power in 1964, there were a number of things that should be noted. First, Guyana was in debt. I think it is now that Carl Greenwich came and put the figures and settled it. The PPP does not speak about inheriting a debt. You know, they stopped talking about that since Mr. Greenwich wrote a letter and put the facts out there. Ghana was in debt. And a large part of that debt was accumulated by Dr. Chedi Jagan. One of the significant differences between the debt accumulated, or there are two significant differences about the debt accumulated by the PNC and the debt accumulated by the PPP. The debt accumulated by the PNC, you can see the projects for them. You have difficulties
Examples.
seeing the, I'm coming to that just now, seeing the results of it. The second thing about the debt under the PNC, a lot of it is interest. The PPP has accumulated as much debt as the PNC without it being interest. I want to make those 2 points. When the PNC came to power, apart from the debt, people must remember the thing of paved roads was restricted to Georgetown. It means is that it is to Burnham's credit that Skeldon to Georgetown had paved roads. Linden to Georgetown. Purika to Vidinhoop. Potentia to Vidinhoop. The only area that I know that did not have that kind of road was the Essequibo Coast. And the road that was built on the Essequibo Coast was built with a loan that was already mobilized by the PNC when it left government in 1992. And the PPP made a mincemeat of it. The corruption, etc., caused the road to take much longer than it did. I'm saying this to point out that the infrastructure that was placed by Burnham was placed in virtually all regions. And so, to suggest that nothing happened in 28 years is really political trash. But the PPP likes to talk about 28 years. Let me also remind people that when Burnham came to power in 1964, we used to import virtually every fruit and vegetable. And it is the policies of Burnham that caused us to end up in a situation where we started to export, to first of all develop and produce the cabbage, the bora, the belange, whatever, so that Ghana became self-sufficient in food. Though one can argue successfully that one of the negative consequences of banning was that some of the foreign items that were needed, you couldn't get. That is a fact. Nobody can change that. But what nobody can change as well is that Burnham's agricultural policy resulted in food self-sufficiency in Ghana, to the point where Robert Passad and company was so ashamed. They didn't want to say grow more food, as Burnham said. They said grow more. But Guyanese aren't idiots. As it relates to housing, when we came to power in 1964, Burnham came to power in 1964, the approach to housing that Dr. Jagan had was these scheme houses. With all the problems that emerged in East Rheinveld, West Rheinveld, it was Burnham that actually suggested that this kind of housing structure had negative consequences. I remember in a discussion once, Burnham pointing out the problems that emerged with the projects in the United States and the similar type of thing in the United Kingdom. And it suggested that Ghana will develop under him people in their own separate houses to get away from some of the problems that come with the kind of living that Dr. Jagan encouraged in Wismar housing scheme, in East Rheinveld, in West Rheinveld. And if you see the houses developed by Burnham, it produced a new pattern, a new approach. And so I think Burnham's housing policy was much better and much clearer. Not to mention this trash of house lot distribution that fails to put in place the many things that are required to develop proper housing scheme. I just touch on those. There are many, many more. The concept of self-help. The PPP is help self. There's no doubt about that. Every minister you can find has a property. The former president sell a house for $100 million. If a house is valued at $100 million, the mortgage for that house has to be well over $200,000 a month. Put it against the salary of anybody and explain how people can, in this mechanism, build houses of that value on their salaries. Don't ask about corruption, just keep that quiet. And so I'm saying to you, the other characteristic of the Burnham era that should be pointed out is that they could have said what they wanted about Burnham. At the end of the Burnham government, including Height, you did not have anything that approximated the wanton corruption and wealth and palatial outlays that you see under this government.